does not receive annual appropriations. It does provide the Parliament with opportunities to discuss its insight and performance, which the committee greatly welcomes. As such, no government minister will be in attendance with the committee while representatives of the RBA are present. Mr. Lowe, thank you very much for joining us. Ms. Bullock, thank you for joining us. Would you like to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Senator, for the invitation to join you. We don't have an opening statement. We're really just here to answer your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, on that basis, I'll proceed to Senator Hume.
Thank you both for attending today. Could I first ask whether you believe current monetary policy settings are expansionary, contractionary or neutral?
As things currently stand, monetary policy is restrictive. You see that in the fact that...
Is that the same as contractionary?
Yeah, contractionary. It's restricting. You see that in the fact that housing prices are falling, the rate of home building has slowed down, and people are having to pay a lot more on their mortgages. Those things are all contracting or restricting growth in the economy. So monetary policy is restrictive.
And when you make your decision, when the board makes its decision on interest rates and whether to raise them, whether to lower them, or whether to keep them the same, what are the things that it takes into consideration?
The decision making really is around the first centre point is the inflation target and the inflation outcomes. I mean, inflation at the moment, 7.8%, is way too high. It needs to come down. So that's our primary consideration. When we take our decisions each month, we're looking at the data on inflation, the data on the labour market, how household spending is evolving, and how the global economy is evolving. All those things are important, and the Reserve Bank Board meets every single month, and we look at each of those things each month and make an evaluation of the outlook for inflation. And it's, as I've said, it's way too high and it needs to come down.
In the Reserve Bank's opinion, is the current fiscal policy expansionary, restrictive or neutral?
Our assessment is that it's broadly neutral. If you take the federal government and the state governments together, which I think is the best way to think about it, the budget deficit's a share of GDP around 3%, and it's likely to stay around that mark for the next few years. The federal budget deficit narrows a bit and then widens, and the states are doing the reverse. So the best way to think about whether fiscal policy is contractionary or expansionary is to look at the change in the aggregate budget deficit, and over the forecast period there's little change in the budget deficit as share of GDP. So I would describe it as neutral.
Shouldn't it be contractionary if inflation is at the level that it is today?
I'm not going to comment on what the government should or shouldn't do. The Treasurer doesn't comment on what I should or shouldn't do, and so I'm not going to comment on the direction of fiscal policy. I can make kind of perhaps one general observation is that at the moment aggregate demand growth has been too strong, and interest rates are part of the way that we bring that back down again. Interest rates are a nimble policy tool. They're a blunt policy tool, but they're nimble. The Reserve Bank Board meets every month, and we can take decisions every month based on the flow of information. The received wisdom over recent time is that fiscal policy, most of the time, is not as effective as managing the cycle. Because if you're going to have fiscal measures introduced, it has to go through the House of Representatives, the Senate, and that takes time. And I broadly ascribe to this view that fiscal policy most of the time should be dealing with the structural issues and structural budget position, and except for in extraordinary times, it's not the best tool to use to manage aggregate demand. Interest rates, for all the faults and all the problems we have, is the more nimble tool.
Can I just clarify, when you say that fiscal policy is neutral, in your opinion, does that mean that it's not assisting to bring inflation down?
I wouldn't characterise it that way. really, again, depends upon the counterfactual. The government has got a lot of extra revenue because of the high commodity prices, so if it decided to spend that now, that would have been problematic. So we welcome the fact that the government has decided to save most of the extra revenue there. There are other elements of fiscal policy that can help as well. The government's energy package, our estimate is that the price caps there will reduce inflation in 2024 by a half percentage point. That's meaningful, so that's helpful. So the government can take measures in specific parts of the economy that have an effect on prices. The other thing it can do is to free up the supply side of the economy. If there's greater competition, more investment, more freedom on the supply side of the economy, then the price pressures in specific areas for any given level of aggregate demand is going to be less. So specific measures in particular industries, flexibility on the supply side and aggregate demand. They're the three tools the government has to affect the inflation outcomes, and it's really up to the government and the parliament to decide what combination of those tools they use.
So as a rule of thumb, do you believe that fiscal policy and monetary policy should be aligned?
In general, yes. I mean, but you know, fiscal, as I said, fiscal policy has not just doesn't need to be worried just about management of the cycle. There are structural issues that we need to pay attention. I think in previous hearings in this building, I've talked about the importance of maintaining medium-term structural budget integrity. There are huge demands on the public purse, as you know, and we need to find a way to meet those demands if we want to, and the answer isn't borrowing. So that's the kind of first-order issue for fiscal policy, and over and above beyond that, it's helpful if monetary policy and fiscal policy aren't working in opposite directions, and they're not at the moment.
Can I ask, just first of all, you mentioned before that, and which I thought was very generous of you, that you don't comment on government's decisions as part of its fiscal policy and what the government should do. First of all, may I ask, is there anything specifically around that structural deficit that you would like to see the government doing?
Nothing specifically right at the moment, but we've talked before in these hearings about the importance of having a strong budget position in the medium term, because at some point in the future we'll have another downturn and we want the government to be able to respond, and you can only do that if the budget is a strong structural position. And my observation, and the observation of others, is there are a lot of demands on the public purse coming from health, ageing, defence, disability, education. The society wants the public sector to provide these things. If the governments want to do it, they need to find a way of paying for it, and that way isn't debt. So the best outcome, as we talked in previous hearings about, is to make the pie bigger through addressing the supply side. So that's what I would, in broad terms, that's what I would like to see over time, efforts to make the pie bigger so that the demands on the public purse can be more effectively met. But that's not affecting kind of right now, but that's what I'd like to see in the medium term.
So I get a sense there that your views are aligned with those of the IMF, that those large off-balance sheet funds can potentially be inflationary, can potentially cause debt to rise, and that would make your job that bit harder.
Well, they can add to aggregate demand, and we take that into account in our forecasts. They can also increase the supply side of the economy over time. So this is, I think, probably part of the government's intention, that these funds are used to address supply side issues. So in the medium term, that can, if these policies are wisely conducted, make the pie bigger. And making the pie bigger helps us all.
You said, and as I said, I thought it was a generous comment that you weren't going to direct the government how it should be running its fiscal policy. Sadly, I don't think the government has been quite so generous towards you. We know that the Assistant Treasurer, Stephen Jones, commented to reporters on Tuesday saying that that we think, the government, are doing our bit, which is putting downward pressure on interest rates, We also think that there is plenty of evidence that the stuff that's already in the system, the interest rate rises that are in the system, are pulling money out of the economy and dampening down demand. We are concerned that further increases are going to put pressure on households and businesses. Now, this is the comments of the Assistant Treasurer. I would imagine that, considering they are quite contrary to those that you have expressed, that would not be particularly helpful for you or for members of the board in doing the very difficult job that they are tasked with doing, which is to bring down inflation. Am I right?
I mean, the minister has kind of identified one of the risks, and the risks at the moment are two-sided. There is a risk that the tightening of policy that's taken place does dampen spending more than we think. We don't have a perfectly clear crystal ball. So there is a risk there. So I understand why people have focused on the risk. But there is a risk on the other side. There is a risk that we have not yet done enough with interest rates and spending is more resilient and that inflation stays high. If inflation stays high, it's very damaging for the economy. It worsens income inequality. It makes it harder for businesses to plan. It erodes the value of people's savings. It's corrosive for the economy. And all the evidence is that if inflation stays high for too long, expectations adjust, and that ultimately leads to higher interest rates and more unemployment. So the risks are two-sided, and we're trying to navigate our way through a narrow path. I understand why some people focus on the risks on the one side, but we've got to be attentive to the risk from higher inflation. It's more than 30 years since we had higher inflation. I think many people have forgotten the really serious damage that does to people, to livelihoods, the functioning of the economy if it persists, and it leads to higher interest rates and more unemployment. And we really want to avoid that. So people are free to express their opinion. It's a free country, freedom of speech, and we welcome debate, but we're very cognizant that the risks are two-sided.
Do you feel, Governor, that it's unfair, final question, that it is unfair that A, the blame for high interest rates and high inflation has been sheeted back to you, and that B, the Reserve Bank has been left to do all the heavy lifting?
I wouldn't say it's unfair. It's the job of the central bank to control inflation, to make sure that inflation expectations don't adjust and we avoid all those terrible things. So that's the job of the board of the Reserve Bank. It's not just me. I find sometimes the fact that it's all sheeted down to me is a bit unfair, but because it's the board. There are 9 of us, including Michelle, who make these decisions, and we take them collectively. It's not just me making these decisions. There are 9 people based on the advice of a large staff. So that's the world we operate in. I'm not complaining about it. That's our job. I've got to contain inflation, and I've got to convince the community that we're serious about that. That's our job, and it's unpopular. And I accept that. That's why the central bank is independent in its decision-making from the political process. It's easier for me to do unpopular things than it is for maybe some of you. I don't know. But no, I'm not complaining. It's our job.
Thank you, Governor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Lowe. And I note that you said that you welcome and encourage debate. On that note, I'm about to go to Senator McKim. I do want to advise senators that I'll be going in strict 10-minute blocks because of the interest in this session. Senator McKim.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, Dr Lowe, and good morning, Ms Bullock. Dr Lowe, you induced people into taking on record levels of debt by saying that interest rates were unlikely to increase until 2024. Then you later apologised if people had listened to you. Since you made that statement, you've put up interest rates 9 times in a row and flagged that there are more to come when the preconditions you set at that time for even a single rate rise have not yet been met. You've admitted overdoing monetary stimulus during the pandemic. You said that rents weren't likely to be significantly impacted by interest rate increases, but rents are currently going up at the fastest rate on record. You seem prepared to smash Australia into a recession by trying to squash demand in response to inflation that has, on the RBA's own analysis, been predominantly a result of supply-side factors. Can you explain to the renters and mortgage holders of Australia why you still deserve to hold your job?
I have a 7-year term as the Governor of the bank, and I intend to serve out that term. It's an important job. Comes with public accountability in this part of the process, but I intend to serve out that term. And I would return to the point that I made in response to one of Senator Hume's questions. The decisions that the Reserve Bank make are made by a board of 9 people. It's not just me.
Understand.
We make them collectively and collaboratively, and the board has made these decisions, and I think it would be a very bad outcome for the board to have to resign. It's a collective responsibility. Can I just pick up on one other issue that you raised? You said that I seem intent on smashing Australia into a recession. Can I assure you that's not our intention? We are trying to navigate a narrow path here. We want to get inflation down because it's dangerous. It's corrosive, it hurts people, it damages income inequality, and if it stays high, it leads to higher interest rates and more unemployment. So we want to get inflation down, but we also want to preserve the gains in employment that we've made. The unemployment rate today is the lowest in 50 years. That's a huge national benefit. People have jobs that in the past wouldn't have had jobs. Kids get opportunities, they get on the ladder of opportunity and success. People are getting the hours they want, and the employment to population ratio has never been higher. So the higher share of Australians have jobs today than ever before. We really think that's good news. It doesn't get reported very much, but it's good news, and we want to preserve as much of that good news, that progress that we made on the labour market as possible. So there's a narrow path here, and there are risks in both directions. Our objective is to travel that narrow path as best we can. No doubt we'll get buffeted around it and maybe we'll get hit off it, but we want to bring inflation down and we want to preserve those really hard-won gains in the labour market we've made. There's a chance that we can do this. It's not guaranteed, but there's a chance that we can do it, and we want to see inflation down and keep the gains in the labour market.
All right, thanks, Dr. Lowe. Those matters I raised in my first question, and that's a litany of errors. You've admitted to some of those, you've apologised for others. Do you accept that independence should not mean a lack of accountability?
No, of course not. I mean, it's accountable. I'm accountable through this process. I'm accountable through the media commentary, which you might have observed is non-stop and around the clock. So there's a lot of accountability. I explain myself here, and I'll be here for another 3 hours in this building on Friday answering questions from members of the House of Representatives. So I feel there's a lot of accountability, and it's very important that there is.
What do you say to the renters and the mortgage holders of Australia who are getting smashed by interest rate increases while the major banks are pulling in mega profits?
What do I say to the
renters and mortgage holders?
I say we recognise it's really difficult if you've got a mortgage and the interest rate's gone up a lot. I mean, I get a lot of people writing to me at the moment, telling me about their personal circumstances, and it's really, really tough, and we understand that. And you know, I read those letters and hear those stories with a very heavy heart. I find it, you know, personally, it's kind of disturbing. People are really, really hurting, and I understand that. But I also understand that if we don't get on top of inflation, it means even higher interest rates and more unemployment. So the banks are profitable. It's true. It's a positive for the country. We want strong, resilient banks. I know it's hard for people to accept when they're suffering problems with their personal finances, but the country is better off from having strong, resilient, effective banks who can provide the financial services that we need.
All right,
It's
thank
tough,
you.
I know.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
At the House Economics Committee in September last year, you were asked about the impact of interest rates on renters.
Yeah.
And I've just got your quote here. You said it's not particularly large, and you said it's not a first-order effect. Rents are going up at record rates now. Do you stand by those statements?
Yes, perhaps I can unpack that a bit for you. It's clear that when the interest cost goes up, that some landlords want to pass that on in terms of a higher rent. I hear this, landlords tell me this. But I also know that they can only do that successfully if the supply-demand balance in the market is such that people will pay the higher rents. And at the moment, the vacancy rate for rental accommodation is very, very low.
That's right. And
all the evidence is it's the vacancy rate that ultimately determines how fast rents rise. So the vacancy rate summarises the balance between supply and demand, and you can only put your rent up if the balance of supply and demand in the market allows you to do that. So that's, I think, the fundamental issue here. It's the balance of supply and demand in the market. And with population growth picking up again, we need more construction of dwellings. Otherwise, we're going to be in a situation of strong rental growth for a long period of time. And it isn't because interest rates are going up. It's because the supply of rental accommodation is short relative to the demand with stronger population growth. Over recent years, it was partly ameliorated by a change in household size, and it may well happen again that household size starts rising again. So it's the supply and demand balance that ultimately affects rents.
All right.
And the ability of landlord to pass on costs.
All right. Dr. Kennedy said this morning, and I wrote down his exact words, rents are rising to, and I quote, match the interest rate increases. So that's what Dr. Kennedy told this committee this morning. You told the House committee last year that the impact of interest rates on rents are not particularly large and not a first-order effect. Do you understand the tension between those two statements? And are you asserting in your answer that many landlords are just deciding to absorb their increased costs and not pass them on to their tenants?
No, they try and many landlords, not every landlord has borrowings, but many do, obviously. And when their interest costs go up, it's understandable they will try and pass that on to the person paying the rent. So I don't dispute that, and Stephen Kennedy would probably be making the same point. But the additional point that I'm making, and I think it's an important one, they can only successfully do that if the supply-demand balance in the market. So it's a complicated story, but you need both, and ultimately all the evidence that we have is that it's the vacancy rate that drives rents, not interest rates.
I want to ask you about that. I want to ask you about that, Dr. Lowe, because thank you. In Melbourne and Sydney, vacancy rates are very close to the long-run average, but we are seeing record rent increases in those two cities. Given your previous comments, how do you explain that?
Well, the vacancy rates come down very quickly, and particularly in some of the inner city areas and the areas close to the universities.
They're about the long-run average, Dr. Lowe. So if you've got vacancy rates at around the long-run average and rents going up at 10%, about 10% a year, how do you explain that given your previous answer? And don't you think that your statements to the House Economics Committee underestimated the impact of interest rate rises on rents?
No, I would reiterate what the Governor said, but what I would say is that the rental vacancy rates in Melbourne and Sydney are down around levels at which, typically in the past, rents have started to rise. So that's what we're observing. So it's not an historical average. They're starting to get other cities. They're down below their historical lows.
Specifically Melbourne and Sydney. They're about long-run average.
They're not their long-run average.
They're about the long-run average.
They're around their historical lows.
Okay.
So,
thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator McHugh. Senator Bragg.
Well, thanks very much, Chair, and good morning. I wanted to ask you about some comments made by the Assistant Treasurer, which are slightly different from the ones that Senator Hume referred to. The Assistant Treasurer said recently, in relation to interest rate increases, quote, "I'm hoping that if this is not the last, it's near the last of the rate increases," end quote. Is this a statement that the Assistant Treasurer has made to you directly in a meeting or something similar?
No, we've not discussed interest rates, and the governments over a long period of time have not discussed their views on interest rates with the central bank.
Okay. So this is a statement made by a Treasury Minister that hasn't been made to the bank directly?
No.
Okay. Have you met with the Assistant Treasurer at all?
Not recently. I have. I've met him on a number of occasions, particularly in relation to the payment system and the stock exchange, and so there are a number of issues that I have discussed with him in the past, but we've not discussed interest rates.
Okay. I mean, is this a normal thing that a Treasury Minister would be making, these sort of public statements about monetary policy?
It has happened in the past, but it's as I said before, it's a free country, and people are free to be able to express their views on issues. It's up to each of us how we choose to exercise the freedom we have. So, people, if members of the government want to kind of exercise the right to talk about that, it's certainly certainly possible, and I'm not objecting to it.
Okay. Okay. Well, I mean, Governor, the reason I'm asking you about this is because you alluded in your questions, or your answers, I should say, to Senator Hume, that there was an expectation that the government of the day wouldn't comment on monetary policy, and you, as the central bank, wouldn't give extensive statements about fiscal policy.
Yeah.
Now, in this case, this Treasury Minister has decided to make detailed statements about monetary policy. So would you hope for more reciprocation?
No, as I said, it's a free country, and people are able to express their views as they see fit. But I think the model that we've had for many decades, which has been supported by both sides of government, where the Treasurer of the day doesn't comment on monetary policy, that served the country well, and I would observe that Treasurer Chalmers has not discussed monetary policy in public at all. So different models can work, and we're just focused on doing our job. Okay.
So the statements of the Assistant Treasurer have no bearing in what you'll do?
Well, we listen to people's views. I've listened to many people's views, but no, we take our decisions independently every single month and based on the facts and the analysis. So, no, the commentary out there, we kind of, well, it's kind of interesting to listen to, and we kind of value hearing people's perspectives, but no, we don't.
We'll take it as a no.
Yes, no, it will not. No, it will not affect. No, there's a lot of criticism of the bank at the moment. We understand that. We talk about that at the board meeting, and we evaluate the arguments. So we rely on the evidence, the data, and the arguments.
Okay.
That's what influences us.
Okay. Well,
not what people say.
Thank you for clarifying that. I just want to ask you briefly about what I think is an attack on the independence of the bank. You might be aware there's been a coordinated attempt by members of the government, backbench members of the government, to attack you. And in fact, I have one of the quotes here from Mr. Laxale, who's the member for Bennelong, and he's mentioned that you seemingly made a choice between speaking to the Australian public and attending a cosy lunch. And he suggests that he encourages you to address that proactively in your opening address today. I think you noted that you'll be here today and again on Friday. I mean, what do you make of this coordinated attack on the bank's independence?
I'm not aware of any coordinated attack or any attack at all on the bank's independence. But when we're raising interest rates, it's unpopular in large parts of the community, particularly given the history of the low interest rates over recent years. It's unpopular. And it's the job of the central bank to do sometimes what's unpopular in the national interest. And that's what we're doing. some people don't like it, and they're free to comment on that, but it's not going to affect the decision-making process. We have 9 people who sit down every month and say, what's the right thing to do here by the country? Even if it's unpopular, we do it. We know it's hard. We're balancing various risks. So I don't feel like there's an attack on the bank or its independence, but it's noisy. If there was an opportunity, I could address the issue of the lunch since you've raised it, or maybe there's not.
I think it's an urgent issue for Mr. Laxale, who's not here at the moment, so we'll get you to address it.
Thank you. Is it
Now?
it's okay?
Well, it's
Yep.
Why not?
Okay.
If it's okay with you, as you would know, it's a long-standing practice of the Reserve Bank to talk to market participants, to businesses, to journalists, to politicians, to civil society. We do that all the time, and if you go on the bank's internet site, you can see all the people, the institutions I meet with. We think it's really important we do that. We don't want to live in a bubble. We want to hear what people have to say and what their questions are. And I did that last week with this lunch at Barrenjoey, which you've all read about. A number of people have questioned why I did that rather than a public speech. In previous years, I've generally started the year with an address to the National Press Club and then a 3-hour hearing at the House Economics Committee, and I've done that in the first week of February. From my perspective, that worked quite well, but I had feedback about that. One piece of feedback was maybe you're talking too much, and it is possible to talk too much. So I was being conscious of that. And the other piece of feedback that I'd had was that to start the year, it's better to address the questions of the Parliament rather than the media. Having both in the same week an address to the National Press Club and then a 3-hour appearance before the House Economics Committee, some people suggested to me the order should be reversed. It should be the Parliament whose questions I answer in a 3-hour session rather than 15 minutes of questions following an address to the National Press Club. So people made that point to me. I thought, well, there's something to that. And normally I would have addressed the House Economics Committee last Friday, but that got pushed back to this Friday. So I listened to that feedback and I decided that this year I would first address the questions asked of me of the Parliament, and that got pushed back a week. So there was a gap in my diary, and I wanted to, because the parliamentary hearing got pushed back a week, and I wanted to hear what people in the market had been saying about our recent decision. So I accepted an invitation to that lunch. I hear that many people have concerns about the timing between the Reserve Bank Board meeting and the release of the statement on monetary policy, which is on the Friday. I thought that was manageable, but I hear many people are concerned about that, so we're responding to that, and we'll no longer do those type of lunches before the release of the statement on monetary policy. So there's nothing untoward here. It's appropriate. I can't live in a bubble. I need to talk to people. I need to hear what financial markets say, and I like asking people questions. You asked me questions today. At these lunches, I ask people questions about what they think.
We like it too, Mr. Lowe.
Yeah, so that's the world we're in, and in general, and for many years, we've been able to have these and other meetings with the understanding of all participants that people in the meeting don't run to the press straight afterwards. If you're meeting with me, you want to have confidence that I'm not going to go to the press or tell other people what you've said, and I expect the same courtesy. And that's what happens 99.9% of the time. That did not happen. There's nothing untoward here, but the standard courtesy that we presume you do this as well, meet with people and you don't expect them to run to the press straight after. So that didn't happen on this occasion, but there's nothing untoward here, and I want to talk to people. We are going to change our practice.
Well,
Final question.
Thanks very much. Well, appreciate that expansive explanation. I personally am not concerned about that. I understand it's part of your role. I'm more concerned about the attack on you personally, and from members of the government's backbench and the executive in part, and whether that would erode the independence of the central bank. So again, I just ask, are there any steps you're taking to protect and preserve the independence of the bank from these political attacks?
I don't feel like at the independence of the institutions under attack, and it's not affecting our decision making. Let me assure you that the decisions are based on the data, the analysis and the facts, and that's not the noise around, and we'll continue to operate that way. So there's the Treasurer and I haven't really spoken about interest rates. It's not that's the way we operate, and there's no pressure from the Treasurer, Treasurer Chalmers. So it's noisy, but raising interest rates is always unpopular. It affects the whole community, and the representatives of the community, understandably, will sometimes want to talk about that. But we keep doing our job, and our job is to make sure inflation comes down and hopefully preserve the gains in unemployment that we've made.
Senator Smith.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks very much, Governor and Deputy Governor, for making yourself available to the Parliament. As an old-fashioned parliamentarian, I do appreciate the significance of the gesture. Going back to your opening remarks, am I correct in assuming that there's a level of, or that there's a poor understanding in the Australian electorate about the corrosiveness of high inflation because we have been spared it for many decades?
Yeah, whether there's a poor understanding, I don't know about that, but I think people have forgotten. For many years, inflation varied, between maybe 1.5% and 3.5%, and we all got very exercised if inflation was half a percentage point away from 2 or 2.5. So that was the world we were living in. People really forgot about how corrosive inflation was and how it eroded your savings, how it made income inequality worse, how it really hurt the poor. So I think we've forgotten about that because it's 30 years since we lived in that world, and our job as the country's central bank is to make sure that doesn't happen, and part of the way we do that is to remind people of the dangers of it and say, well, look, if we return to that world, you'll have all these nasties again. I know it's really hard for people to have to pay more on their mortgages, but it'll be harder still if inflation gets too high and stays too high. It'll mean even higher interest rates and more unemployment. And it's hard for people to kind of understand that because we haven't been in that world for 30 years.
And I would just add that in a world where we've been in, where inflation's been quite low and stable, people didn't worry about it. It was in the background. It's not something that affects their decisions. It's not part of their thinking. And you can see how that's changed now. It's basically on everyone's lips. They're worried about it. That's the difference. What we want to go back to is a world where it's just in the background and people aren't worrying about it.
One of our national papers described the rate rise as an inflation SOS. Do you think that the electorate is starting to appreciate the urgency and the emergency around the inflation impact on the economy?
I hope that people understand that inflation is damaging and corrosive, and perhaps the media coverage of our decision last week has reinforced that. I also want people to understand that we're really serious about this. It's not something that we're going to say, oh, well, we'll run the risk and have inflation stay high. It's just too costly, too damaging and corrosive. So I hope that message is getting across to the community. And if inflation expectations can stay well anchored, and at the moment they are, then firms will reflect that in their pricing decisions, and we'll see the same in wage outcomes as well. So if inflation expectation can stay anchored, we can stay on that narrow path, and our communication is partly aimed at reinforcing the need for inflation expectations to stay anchored and convince people that this period of high inflation is only going to be temporary. If we can do that, then we can stay on the narrow path. But if people start to think inflation is going to be 7 and 8% the year after next, then we're going to have all sorts of trouble. I think people understand that now.
Governor, how high will unemployment have to rise to get inflation in check?
That's a very good question, and we really don't know the answer to that at the moment. Our central forecasts have the unemployment rate getting to 4.5% next year, and that being enough broadly to get the inflation rate down to 3% over the next couple of years. If we can do that, that central forecast comes to fruition, it'll be a good outcome for the country, won't it? Because we will have got to 4.5% unemployment, which before the pandemic, the lowest we got to was a bit above 5. But there's a lot of uncertainty around this, and it partly depends upon how wage outcomes develop. If wage outcomes kind of stay in a reasonable ballpark, then I think we can manage this, what I see as a fairly soft landing. We're keeping the unemployment rate below where it was before the pandemic.
What are the risks in regards to that wage dimension that you've just talked about?
Well, one risk would obviously be that people say inflation's 7.8%, I need a 7.8% pay rise, because if that happens, then inflation's going to be high next year, and then we have another high pay rise in the year after that inflation's high, and we're in this nasty world I talked about. So that's one risk. But I think you've got to keep it in perspective at the moment. At the moment, we don't really see evidence of that occurring. We think that the growth in the wage price index will get up to 4%, maybe a bit higher, and probably not go much higher than that. But there are risks here. If we end up in the world I was describing before, where people link wage increases one for one with inflation, then inflation will persist and it'll be more difficult. But at the moment, that's not happening. The enterprise agreements that have been signed over the past 4 or 5 months have bigger wage increases this year, but then next year they're a bit lower again. And we hear this from firms in our liaison as well. They're giving workers a bigger increase this year, but they're saying to their workforce, well, next year we've got to go back to something more modest. I hope that's how it works out. But if it doesn't, we'll have problems.
Governor, you have, in your earlier remarks, talked about the collective and collaborative nature of board discussions and board decisions. Am I right to assume that board decisions are unanimous?
Well, we go around the table each time, and each board member expresses their views, and the experience that I've had as Governor is that we all come to the same conclusion. We explore the issues from every angle. Maybe, Michelle, you can reflect on it as well, because I'm chairing the meetings, but you're a member, so...
Yeah. Yes, I would. It's a very open discussion. I mean, I've only been involved in it regularly for the last 9 to 10 months, but we go around the room. But before we do that, we have an active discussion about possible options, and I think we've expressed those in some of our press releases as well, post-meeting, that we've mentioned the options we've discussed. I've observed discussions where some people have come in sort of with a particular view and then heard alternative arguments and changed their mind. But my experience personally is that in the end, when we go around the room and everyone is specifically asked, there is a unanimous coming together on what is the best thing to do.
And sometimes the meetings are, I'll say, well, we're really unsure about what the right outcome is. We should do A or B. What do you think? And we go around and we collectively work it out. And other times I have a stronger view about the answer should be A, and I'll say that, but I always present to the board the arguments for B as well.
So perhaps we should invite the entire board to appear and not just the chair and the deputy chair of the board.
Well, that would be up to you.
Thank you
but
very
the
much.
board has agreed in the past that, for better or worse,
That's right.
I'm the
our
spokesman of the
jobs
Bird on
very
monetary policy. That's what they've agreed, for better or worse. So, as you know, there's a review of the Reserve Bank currently underway, and I expect this will be one of the issues that comes out of that review, how we communicate and the accountability mechanisms, and the things that we should be talking about.
Governor, I think I should ask you the same question they asked the Treasury Secretary, but I asked the Treasury Secretary whether or not fiscal policy was playing a subsidiary role to monetary policy at the moment, and he provided an answer, and you might have seen that. But what's your response to that question?
We covered some of this material before. I think fiscal policy is broadly neutral from a demand management side. The government's saving most of the terms of trade revenue boost, so that's positive. it would be problematic if that were not the case and that money was being recycled back into aggregate demand, but that's not, so I welcome that. And then the other two parts of fiscal policy affecting the prices in some specific sectors and adding to the supply side, and the government has initiatives in both those areas. It's up to others to comment on whether the balance is right, but it's positive they're not recycling the terms of trade revenue, and they do have some measures in the energy market and adding to some flexibility on the supply side in some areas. So always can do more, but from where I sit at the moment, it's not problematic.
This final
If
question,
fiscal policy is neutral, isn't that an opportunity? Doesn't that mean that there are opportunities not being realised?
I mean, again, at a very high level, you could have more restrictive fiscal policy, and that would take some pressure off aggregate demand. But the difficult
and take pressure off the inflation rate.
Perhaps, but I think that one of the difficulties here, and governments right around the world have dealt with this, is the flexibility of fiscal policy to tighten up and loosen up. It's pretty hard, for the government to go through and use fiscal policy in a counter-cyclical way. During the COVID crisis, it was easy. It was clear there was a national emergency, things happened very quickly, but most of the time, if we're talking about trying to reduce aggregate demand by 1%, it's a pretty surgical thing that has to be done, and getting that through the parliament and making all decisions, that's tough for any government. So that has led to the position we're in, where monetary policy is used mainly to manage aggregate demand, and fiscal policy looks to the structural issues. You could have a different setup, but it's hard. The governance of fiscal policy is harder than the governance of monetary policy.
I do have some other questions if time allows.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Canavan.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Governor. I just noted your comment earlier about investments that can help increase the productive side of the economy. And just at a general point of view, are policies that help expand productivity disinflationary, if you like? Do they help moderate inflationary pressures?
Well, obviously it depends upon the specifics, but in general, yes. If you can expand supply, then that helps. If we can increase competition, that puts downward pressure on prices. If there are more workers available and you increase labour supply, that helps. So expanding the supply side in the short run puts downward pressure on inflation, and in the long run makes the pie bigger. And if you've got a bigger pie, your job's going to be easier too.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so, getting more specific, I mean, we've had a period of relatively low inflation until recently, decades of it. To what extent do you think the microeconomic reforms of the past generation have helped contribute to that relatively subdued inflationary environment?
I think they were incredibly important, and they're also important to expanding the pie. One of the reasons the Australian economy did so well over many decades was that we had a series of reforms that made us more competitive, made the economy more dynamic, and that delivered stronger growth. So the pie was bigger, and developments on the supply side, not just in Australia but globally. China was obviously a really important part here. So supply side developments made the job of central banks much easier. And they also expanded the pie. So this is a call that I've often made, is we need to refocus on expanding the supply side.
Well, with that in mind, in the past year, we've seen the government re-regulate labour and now energy markets. If removing restrictions on the economy helps subdue inflation, wouldn't reintroducing restrictions in these very important markets add to inflationary pressures?
Well, again, it depends upon the specifics, and I don't want to be drawn into the specifics of the IR legislation. But I know the Treasurer has said that he's got the 5-yearly review of the Productivity Commission by the Productivity Commission on his desk. So it's got more than 1,000 pages, and he plans to release that in March or April. And I hope that's going to give us some new ideas on how to expand the supply side and make the economy more flexible. I expect it'll talk about the need to invest in people, in technology, in energy, and better delivery of government services. So I think I'm hoping that 5-yearly review re-energises the discussion about productivity and enhancing supply. We'll see.
Right. Well, just drilling down to the labour situation there, and look, I have been critical of some of your commentary in the past, but I understand that you have a tough job to do right now. One of the potential consequences of these tough decisions you're making is that it may force some businesses to the wall. We've spoken about mortgages and households, and that will, of course, lead people to lose their jobs. Has the Reserve Bank at this stage looked at what will be potentially impact on bankruptcies and business performance of higher interest rates?
We don't forecast the bankruptcy rate, which has been very, very low during the COVID period, and it's risen a little bit, but it's still, in historical terms, low. How many business failures we see will ultimately depend upon how the economy grows. And our central forecast is for growth of 1.5% this year and next. If we can get that, then some businesses will find things difficult, but I don't think it's going to be a major problem.
Right.
But if the economy kind of contracts, then businesses are going to find things more difficult. But
and people will lose their jobs
people
too.
will lose their jobs. And it's possible, we're aware that that's a risk, and some people criticise the bank board for meeting every month. But at the moment, I'm glad we meet every month because we can assess the data, we can look at a very high frequency what's going on. At turning points, it's really valuable to meet frequently, and we can be responsive.
Right. And so how important then in that context, there's obviously a risk, as you recognise, there's a risk that at least some businesses fail and people lose their jobs as we seek to have a landing, soft or otherwise. How important is it then to have flexible labour markets in that environment such that businesses can respond to the changes that are caused by a higher interest rate environment?
Businesses need to be able to respond both in headcount and hours worked, and hours work has become an increasingly important element of flexibility that businesses have, so it's beneficial to retain that. But the general principle has to be right, doesn't it, that if the business environment's uncertain, businesses should have flexibility. And I'm not going to comment on whether the changes that have been made impair or enhance that, but the principle you're articulating is surely right.
Okay, thank you. Just on the energy side of things, how much has the disruption in energy flows resulting from the war in Ukraine contributed to inflation over the past year now almost?
Well, substantially. At one point, the price of petrol, I think was the annual rate, was up 30%. So that makes a big difference. And the sky-high prices of gas and coal in Europe flowed through back into our domestic market. So that's been a first-order issue. But it hasn't just been energy; it's been food and a lot of kind of the supply chain. So it's worked its way through. The more positive story here is we're through the worst of that. And most commodity prices
are back to that. I mean, if the removal of energy flows from Russia can have such an impact on Australian inflation, how much impact will come from the government's decisions causing investments in gas in Australia to be deferred? How much impact will that have? We've seen over the past month major investments in Queensland, in Victoria, deferred as a result of the government's changes or interventions in energy markets. I'm not asking you to comment on those interventions. I'm just saying, given that that's happened, it's a fact that those investments are not proceeding, how much of an impact of lower energy flows in Australia, energy supply in Australia, will have an impact on inflation?
Yeah, this is not my area of expertise, and I think it's really a medium-term issue, because if there's less investment there, hopefully there's more investment somewhere else. So what rate of
You mean somewhere else
expansion
in Australia, or
in Australia or elsewhere around. I mean, we need.
sure
This is
that
kind of
quite
one of the
follows,
issues
but-
I highlighted in a speech last year, that the existing capital stock to produce energy is depreciating, and we're not kind of reinvesting in the existing capital stock, but we're investing in new capital stock, and I don't know how that's going to all balance out, but.
I'm just a little confused that there has been a lot of commentary on the Russian situation, and you've referred to it here and before, and so has the Treasury Secretary. The government refers to it endlessly. So much focus on what Vladimir Putin's doing, but then, and how that plays out into interest rates and monetary policy settings, but almost no interest in the investment settings for energy in Australia. You're not following that by the sounds of it either. Wouldn't that have more of an impact on Australia's inflationary environment? This is a perfectly reasonable question. I don't think.
Can I just answer quickly there? These investment decisions are multi-year things, and so will play out over multiple years, and it'll depend upon how much other investment takes place in other forms of energy. Next year, in 2024, the government's recent initiative will reduce inflation by around 0.5 percentage point. That's within our kind of normal forecasting horizon. I think the issues that you're talking about are important, but they're really beyond the next 18 months to 2 years.
Yeah, it just seems, look, and I don't quite accept what, as you say, it's not your area, but some of the deferrals of investment will have an immediate impact on energy flows, particularly those in coal seam gas, where there is a requirement for annual investments. They're not as long-lived as offshore. It just seems to me that...
Just as you finish up, this would be your last question. Thanks.
We just seem to have an unhealthy focus on international developments here, and not enough focus on what we are doing to our own energy markets right here and how that impacts on inflation. Is there anything you can encourage us to look at in this microeconomic reform space? I know you've commented on this in general terms before. Is there anything that we should focus on in energy, labour, capital markets that would make your job easier?
Over time, expansion of the capital stock that produces cheap, reliable energy will help. How you do that, I don't know. But it must be true again, kind of the principle of cheap, reliable energy, and we need the capital stock to be put in place in the country to deliver that. So whatever you can do in this place to help, I'd welcome that.
Thank you. Senator McKim.
Thanks, Chair. And just to tie off the previous discussion, I just wanted to make it clear that my statements around vacancy rates in Melbourne and Sydney being about the long-term run average levels were based on the statement on monetary policy that was issued by the Reserve Bank on last Friday. Dr Lowe, you've addressed to a degree your Barrenjoey lunch, and I think thank you for your commitment to make more public statements before you do events like that in the future, and I think that's a good thing. But can I ask you, I mean, what did you share with a bunch of bankers at the Barrenjoey banquet that you can't share with mortgage holders and renters, and why did the bond market jump so markedly actually during that lunch that you had? What did you say to them that pumped up the bond market so markedly while you were actually at that lunch?
What did I share with them? I shared the messages in the statement that was released on Tuesday afternoon, and those messages included that we're serious about getting inflation under control, we're on a narrow path, and we want to preserve the gains in unemployment we've made. So they're the main messages, and I've talked about those much more expansively today than I did at that lunch. And I sought views from the people at that lunch on a range of issues, including how resilient is household spending, how the labour market's likely to evolve, kind of as the wage outcomes we're seeing at the moment, are they likely to be sustained? I asked them how our message has landed. Got mixed feedback on that. We talked about the potential for supply shocks in the future to make inflation more variable. That was an issue I raised in a speech last year, and how we should be thinking about monetary policy about that, and also talked about the level of interest rates in Australia being lower than elsewhere in the world, and I got their views on that. So it was kind of interactive, and I pushed back on the proposition that I shared with them things that I'm not sharing here or with the Australian people in other ways.
It's the timing of it.
It's the timing, and I accept the timing. Kind of people find that kind of difficult, and if I'd had my time again, I'd do things differently, but we have changed our policy now so it's the timing. I addressed the issue about the market moves because when I saw that, I was concerned about something untoward could have happened. But these are the facts that I as I know them, and I want to share those with you. I arrived at the lunch at 12:30 after the executive committee at the bank, and then I had a brief discussion with the CEO and the chief economist of Barrenjoey about their business model and how things were going and the competition they were bringing to the marketplace. And then we went into the room with the maybe 15 or 20 guests. We sat down and I started speaking probably around 12:50 after the CEO of Barrenjoey told the room about the things they were doing. So I would have started speaking around 12:50, 10 to 1, and the lunch finished at 2.
All right.
So we've looked at the bond yields. They started rising at 12 o'clock. They'd been rising earlier in the morning, and then for an hour or two they'd been flat, and then they started rising at 12 o'clock.
So you don't think there's a correlation?
And then they rose kind of fairly steadily between 12 and 2 o'clock.
That's right.
Exactly the same movements were happening in New Zealand market at the same time, and over the couple of days, the movements in the Australian yields were almost exactly the same as the movement in US Treasuries. So they're the facts as I know it. The movements in bond yields started before, and a lot of it was already done before I started speaking. So they're the facts as I know it, and I can't say any more, but it's the
Sure.
We've investigated it thoroughly, and that's what we've found.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Lowe. Look, you're hearing... You say you can't... excuse me. You say you can't live in a bubble, and I think that's right. And you hear directly from bankers at lunches like the one at Barrenjoey. You hear directly from big business through your business liaison program. But how are you ensuring that the pain that renters and mortgage holders are feeling is adequately factored in to the decisions that the RBA is making? And how are you hearing directly from the people that are bearing the brunt of decisions? So in other words, you're hearing directly from people who have a desire for profit. Big business, the banks. Understand that they want to make money, that's their job. How do you make sure you're factoring in the pain that is being felt by the people that are bearing the brunt of the pain from interest rate rises? How do you make sure that you factor those matters into your decision making at the appropriate level compared to big business and big banks who are just interested in making more money?
Yeah, I mean it's a very good question. Recently, I met with the head of ACOS, so here kind of the stress that many low-income people are under. I get, as I said before, many letters from people who are in stress, and I read those with a heavy heart. And our liaison team also talks to the financial counsellors, and there's some of that in the recent statement on monetary policy. So we reach out as best we can to these various groups. It's harder to get together people who are kind of
you could put it.
So we talk to ACOS. We get direct feedback from individuals, and we talk to the service providers who are helping people who are in difficulty, and we hear the message loud and clearly, and we factor that, and we talk about it at every board meeting, how this is really, really hurting some households. But we also talk about, if we don't get on top of this, the pain will be worse. It's not a nice message, but that's the reality we face, and we have to face into that reality.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Lowe. You've spoken again today, as you often do, about wages, and you've not said anything today, and you rarely do, about corporate profits. So the CBA has just announced like a 9% profit this morning.
Yep.
Do you accept that when you put interest rates up, that increases the profits of big banks? And would you agree with Dr. Kennedy's statement this morning that the likelihood of a wage price spiral is low?
When we put up interest rates, the immediate effect, I think, is a boost to bank profits, particularly if they're slow in raising deposit rates, which they have been. and I know the government is concerned about that, and rightly. But over time, higher interest rates, if they lead the economy slowing, make it more difficult for banks. So there's kind of a better now, maybe not so good later on. So that's how it works out. And so the second
part was whether you agreed with Dr. Kennedy that the likelihood of a price wage spiral is low.
Is low. I think it's relatively low, but if we're wrong on that, the costs are very high. So that's, this is the kind of the thing. It's low, but I don't want to give the impression that we're not worried about it, because we are, not because the probability is high, but because the cost of that happening is very high. If we saw that develop, then we're going to have even higher interest rates and more unemployment. So this is why I draw attention to it, not because I'm overly worried about that at the moment. The wage outcomes are still consistent with inflation returning to target, and businesses telling us that next year they're expecting to give smaller increases than this year. So that's all positive, and we welcome that. And I only talk about the wage price spiral to remind people that if that were to change, it's going to be difficult for us all.
Final question, Senator McKim.
All right, well, I'm going to move on just to one last topic in that case. Dr. Lowe, the RBA's most recent statement on monetary policy has two models that show that supply-side factors are responsible for somewhere between 1/2 and 3/4 of the increase in inflation. So I just want to ask you, how do you think monetary policy addresses supply-side issues, and whether you accept that there are other ways to reduce inflation, levers that the government has rather than the RBA, for example, tax policy, that would reduce inflation but would able to be better targeted towards those who have the capacity to pay?
Well, we've talked about the various measures the government could do. It can manage aggregate demand, it can expand supply, or it can do things like it's done in the energy market. So there are options there, and to leave it to others to make judgments about what the right combination is there.
On monetary policy? On
monetary policy and supply shocks, there's very little that monetary policy can do to offset supply shocks, and sometimes you'll want to respond to the higher inflation that comes from a supply shock to stop inflation expectations rising and staying high. But if that doesn't happen, you can let the supply shocks wash through the system. But the other point I want to make here is probably half, a quarter to half, maybe roughly, is from demand. And we really saw that in the December quarter, and this was really quite important for us. In the December quarter, the price of clothing and footwear went up 2.2%. That's 5% over the year. In other countries, it was starting to slow. The price of non-durable household goods, so stuff you buy at kind of Kmart or a department store, up 2.3%, 12% over the year. Yeah. That's not because of global supply problems. They've been fixed up, and those prices are coming down.
Could be profiteering, couldn't it?
Well, it could, but it strong demand. The retailers tell us that demand has been strong. The price of meals out at restaurants up 2.1% in the quarter, 7% over the year. That's strong demand. People were going out, they were celebrating with their families for the first time in 3 years. Strong demand, prices go up. And the strongest example was the cost of domestic travel and accommodation, 7% up in the quarter. We were all travelling again and wanted to go on holidays. Strong demand, prices go up. So a lot of the inflation we saw in the December quarter was because there is strong demand in the quarter in that. So there is increasingly a demand element to the inflation. We're hoping that, and I'm starting to see some evidence of this, that demand is moderating and the rate of increases in these areas will come back, and at the same time the supply side problems will fix up as well. So that's the basis for inflation comes back down. But demand is driving part of the inflation most recently.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lowe. So I've got a few senators who haven't had a chance to ask questions yet, and some senators who'd like to ask some more questions. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move now to strictly 5-minute blocks. And Senator Rennick, you have the call.
Thanks. Hi, guys. Do you understand the meaning of counter-cyclical measures?
Yes, and monetary policy is one of those.
That's a very good point, because if you believed in counter-cyclical measures, and I'll just qualify this by saying that mortgage repayments are excluded from the price of inflation or the inflation calculation. If we've already got fuel rising, rents rising, why are you increasing the cost of living by increasing interest rates when you should actually be seeking to counter those measures? So you're pouring fuel on the fire rather than relieving inflation, because if interest costs were included in inflation rate, this would actually be reflected in a higher inflation rate, not a lower inflation rate.
Yeah. But higher interest rates work in containing inflation by reducing demand. If people have less money in their pocket, they're going to spend less. And the higher interest rates also affect the exchange rate.
Okay.
Just imagine if we left the interest rates low, the exchange rate would be much lower.
Fuel costs, energy costs, the cost of living are already increasing, so demand will come off. All you're doing is adding fuel to the fire by reducing demand much faster at the cost of austerity to low income earners.
Well, we're trying to get the right balance here, to get aggregate demand to slow, and our judgment is that the level of interest rates broadly will be enough to do that. But
so I'm glad you mentioned that, the right judgment, because you haven't sought to manage the long end of the yield curve rather than raise interest rates 9 times in less than a year. Why didn't you do some jawboning like other central banks do and say that we will raise interest rates at, say, for example, 0.5% every 6 months so that we lift them by 4% over 4 years, rather than do this sudden dramatic 3% rise in less than a year that is going to hurt many businesses and many people who whether you meant to say this or not, had the impression that interest rates weren't going to rise until 2024.
I mean, just to come back to something you said, other central banks are actually raising interest rates more quickly than we have.
Oh, I realise that, but in the past they've used jawboning as a measure rather than this deliberate policy designed to asset strip people over the long term.
Yeah. I'm just not sure jawboning the 10-year bond yield at the moment is going to affect much in the economy.
Well, you can jawbone the 2-year and the 5-year.
Yeah. Well, the 2-year interest rate is really a reflection of what people think that our policy rate will average over the next 2 years, and being as clear as we can about how we think that will evolve. So,
okay, I note before that you mentioned that we're low, we need to improve our capital stock, and you keep saying there's not a lot you can do about the supply side. I disagree with that, because, as Senator McKim has pointed out, the RBA can also be involved with managing the volume of credit, and that was said in the 1937 Banking Royal Commission, the original Royal Commission. If the RBA can lend $188 billion at 0.1% to private banks, and they're profiteering out of that by $5 billion a year, why can't the RBA lend to state governments to build productive infrastructure, like power stations, like dams, at a similar low rate?
If the state governments or the federal government wants to do that, they can obtain funding in the marketplace.
But why do we have to pay a premium? Why will the taxpayer then have to pay the margin on that rather than use our own currency? It's our currency. Why do we have to pay a private bank a 2% margin or a 3% margin to use the currency that's backed by the Australian people and the Australian government?
Well, the taxpayer pays the market rate. The government pays the market rate.
And the private banks profiteer out of that market rate.
Final question, Senator.
It borrows directly from investors, from pension funds, kind of the super funds. There's no kind of bank intermediating that. If they were borrowing from the banks and banks were charging a spread, then I could understand what you're saying. But the bank, the government issues its bonds to the super industry, to foreign investors, and they pay the market
foreign
rate.
Investors then lend it back to us.
And it wouldn't be. It's not the Reserve Bank's job to determine the allocation of credit in the economy.
Well, that's not what the
that would be going
1937
back to
Banking
kind of
Royal
where we
Commission
were some
said.
decades ago. It didn't work out that well.
Okay, thank you. Can I finish off with one question?
Do you have one question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to touch on, I know I've touched on this every time, but the RBA, in a reply to a question on notice, said that you were confident that the Bank of England didn't refine Australia's RBA gold bars. Now, I don't see how you could possibly be confident of that, and I've got one page of what you've given me in terms of these gold bars. These gold bars were refined between 2000, this is just one page, between 2009 and 2019. Now, why are you defending the Bank of England for refining our gold? You've previously said, or Guy de Baal has said, when he was Deputy Reserve Governor, that our gold had never moved, and yet I've got documentation from the RBA that shows those gold bars were refined.
Well, this has been audited kind of extensively, and I've confidence in that process.
It's been audited by your own RBA. It hasn't been audited by external.
We've got nothing more to add on the gold.
Yeah, okay. So basically, you can't explain the disappearance or the refining of our gold bars.
Thank you, Senator Rennick. Senator Roberts.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for being here, Dr. Lowe. In 2016, I had my first Senate estimate session, and I asked the Treasury Secretary, who at the time was John Fraser, a question about the huge increase in money supply. And he pretty much dismissed me and said, no, don't worry about it. The next Senate estimate session, he said, yeah, he acknowledged it. And the third one, he said, yes, the theory is that it will lead to inflation, you're correct, but we haven't seen it yet and we don't know why. So I understand it's a vexing problem, but perhaps you said the words, the best solution is to make the pie bigger, or one of the solutions is to make the pie bigger. You're saying that the answer to the government's funding dilemma is to grow the economy and as a result the tax base. Have you heard of the project Iron Boomerang?
Iron Boomerang,
It involved, we've got the world's best metallurgical coal for making steel in the East Coast and the best iron ore on the West Coast. Build a railway line, fully funded, the investors are ready to go. There's a Senate inquiry taking off on it in the new year, pretty soon. What it would do is take coal to the west and iron ore to the east, massive steel making complexes both in the East Coast and the West Coast. Remove shipping, remove road transport, huge investment. It would add $100 billion to our GDP, which is 5%. Plus, it would open up the north and all of Central Australia. So open it up for the Indigenous living there, open it up for rural communities, open it up for agriculture. Is that something that we should be thinking about?
Well, if the rate of return on that investment is as you described it, and both the financial and social returns as you describe it, then it's something to think about. But
it would make us.
But there may be other, be other projects that have better returns as well. So I don't want to endorse it because I don't know enough about it. But in principle, we should be looking at the financial and social returns we get from these projects, and if they're greater than the cost of funding and the economy's got enough resources to do it, then certainly.
We've got investors, we're told, from overseas lining up, and also from within. So come back to my formal questions that I had. The Reserve Bank spent the COVID years increasing the money supply, as Deputy Governor de Baal said at the time, by electronic journal entry, his words, commonly called printing money. At an earlier estimate, I was given a figure of $508 billion as the total for electronic journal entry since 2019. Can you update that figure, please?
That's still roughly the size. I think our balance sheet's a bit over 600 billion at the moment.
Around about 600 billion.
And
exchange settlement account balances are probably around 450, something like that.
Okay, thank you.
So our balance sheet has roughly $100 billion of banknotes on it.
Yep.
So that's there's still $100 billion of banknotes out there. That's $4,000 for every person in the country, which I find extraordinary. But so that's one of the elements on our balance sheet, and then we have these exchange settlement balances, which are the electronic money that you talked about.
Thank you. So inflation has gone from not a problem to a 30-year high, 7.8% in the December quarter. On the 2nd of February 2022, Dr. Lowe, you said inflation had surprised on the upside, and in March 22, you predicted inflation would peak at 4.2%. That was at the ABA, Australian Banking Association conference that we both attended.
Yep.
Why were you surprised, Dr. Lowe, when many, including myself, had spent 2020 and 2021 warning the Reserve Bank and the government, including its Senate estimates, that the sheer volume of this money expansion would inevitably cause significant inflation?
Yep, certainly people, and you're one of these people who are making the argument that the money supply expansion was ultimately going to be inflationary, and that has played a role, but as we were talking about before, at least half, maybe 3/4 of the increase in inflation is due to what went on in Europe and the supply side disruptions. So, the expansion of the money supply and the low interest rates, and I'd say the government support during the pandemic, has driven inflation. But it's not the full story.
Okay.
Final question, Senator Roberts.
Is 7.8% inflation the price the public is paying for the Reserve Bank supporting the government's wasteful mismanagement of COVID, using lockdowns and other restrictions leading to job seeker, JobKeeper mismanagement that the government caused, which is what necessitated the money creation? Did you even consider saying to the government, no, I'm not going to print the money, the massive amount of money, so perhaps reconsider your COVID strategy?
No, we did not do this, and I want to be very clear about this, we did not do the money creation on the request of the government. The 9 people who sit on the board of the Reserve Bank decided to do this. And we had meetings with the government and we understood...
Excuse me, was it because the government had put in place so many onerous restrictions?
No, it was because, and it's easy to forget this now, in early 2020 we were being told by the health people that tens of thousands of Australians would be dead within months. Remember, there were preparations for, including near the Reserve Bank, for temporary morgues in our cities. Our borders were closed, though we were told the vaccine was maybe 3 years, maybe longer away, that this was going to be something that would take the society a long time to get over. That's what we were being told. That was the information.
And we were observing what was happening overseas.
We saw what was going on in New York and Italy. I mean, it was really, really terrible and scary. People were locked in their homes, and that was the fact base upon which we made the decisions to go on this route. And it turns out that the scientists developed a vaccine much more quickly, and the economy was more resilient, and we did too much. But it wasn't. We didn't do too much because the government told us to. Or we wanted. We thought this was the right thing to do, given the information we had at the time.
Thank you, Mr. Lowe. We're out of time for this line. Sorry, Senator Roberts. Thank you, Mr. Lowe. Senator Hume.
Thank you, Chair. Governor, I just want to ask about some testimony that was given by Dr. Kohler, who came and spoke to the Cost of Living Committee a couple of weeks ago. She said that there are around 800,000 Australian households that are going to be switching from a fixed rate to a variable rate mortgage sometime this year.
That's right.
Which is quite concerning. I know you've spoken in the past about the extent of buffers in people's household budgets or in their mortgages, more importantly. Can you talk me through how that has played out, or that's playing out in what you're seeing in your decision making? You know, what it is that households have in their savings, have in their mortgages that will allow them to absorb changes.
It's a critical issue because the pool of excess savings in Australia is as large as anywhere in the world. And the pool that was built up during the pandemic is more than 20% of 1 year's household disposable income. So there's a huge pool of excess savings. It's not evenly distributed across the population. Lower income people obviously haven't got the same savings as higher income people. And one of the analytical issues we're grappling with here is, how do people view these savings? Do they view them as just an increment to their wealth that they can spend over the coming years, or do they view it as like a piggy bank that now they can go and kind of use to spend over the next little while? So we don't know the answer to that, and that's one reason we're watching the spending data very, very carefully. We've spoken to the banks about the people with fixed rate loans. Some of these people with fixed rate loans have a split loan with a fixed rate and a variable rate component. They have an offset account against the variable rate component, and they built up substantial buffers in those. And other people who just have a fixed rate loan have a deposit account where they've built up substantial buffers. Mm-hmm. So the banks tell us that the people with fixed rate loans, most of them, have been pretty cautious. They knew interest rates weren't going to stay low forever. They've taken a low interest rate for 2, 3 or 4 years as a bonus and saved some. That's good. Not everyone is in that case though. Some people have taken the low interest rate to allow them to spend more, and those people are going to face a lot more difficulty when interest rates go up by 3%. Their repayments have to go up by 3 percentage points. So there's a huge diversity across the population. that the banks tell us they're working with their customers, they're contacting them in advance, and a large number of these people with fixed rate loans have built up buffers in either their variable rate offset account or in their saving account. But
do you get data about mortgage stress, the extent of mortgage stress and how that's been changing?
We get very frequent data on the share of the population that's behind on its mortgage, and it's almost a record low, the share that are 90 days. We also get data on the share that are behind, is it 30 days? And that's ticked up a bit, but it's still very low. And the banks tell us that people are paying their mortgages. This increase in interest rates, while it's come quickly, people can see it coming and adjusting their behaviours. So, but it's still, and I want to acknowledge, it's really, really hard for some people. Some people are going to find a very big increase in their mortgage payments. It's really, really hard, but other people are better prepared.
Can I go to Senator Bragg for 2 questions and Senator O'Neill for 2 questions?
I just have one question that I would really like to say. I was, believe it or not, reading the Reserve Bank Act just for fun.
Thank you.
And I realised that Section 11 has an amazing clause in it, and I'm not entirely sure that you're aware of this.
I am. I know Section 11 well.
Did you realise that if the Treasurer doesn't agree with your policy position, that after a certain amount of toing and froing with the board and swapping of papers, that he can submit a recommendation to the Governor-General, and then the Governor-General, acting with the advice of the Federal Executive Council, may by order determine the policy adopted by the bank. So the Treasurer can override the Reserve Bank's policy.
Yeah, and that's been the case since 1959. That provision has never been used, and in my view, it would be a retrograde step to ever use it.
Let's hope that we don't see Stephen Jones marching to Admiralty House anytime soon.
Don't make me regret my generosity. But
it's a provision there, and I don't, it's appropriate. And ultimately, the government can overrule the central bank. It would be unwise in most cases to do it unless we went completely crazy.
Terribly.
It's a safeguard. I view it as a safeguard mechanism. It's never been used, and let's hope it never gets used.
Senator Bragg, a couple of questions.
Just quickly, you said before, Governor, that you didn't talk to the Treasurer about interest rates. Is that right?
Yes, we talk about the economy, but we don't. And this is not just the current Treasurer, but Treasurers before him. They don't share with me or the Reserve Bank Board their views about what interest rates should or should not do.
Okay.
We talk about the economy, and there are obviously implications of that for interest rates, but it's not something that governments have discussed with the central bank.
Okay. And I just want to get this right for the record. Did you infer before that the cash rate would go to 4.75%?
No, I didn't. If interpreted what I...
No, I just want to make sure we get the record right.
No, it didn't. I mean, I don't think I've talked about a number at all unless I completely misspoke. But no, I didn't. We've got an open mind. We're meeting every single meeting. I don't think we're at the peak yet, but how far we have to go up, I don't know. It's going to depend upon the inflation data, the resilience of spending, the strength of the global economy, and what's happening with prices and wages. So, but I don't think we're at the peak yet.
Okay.
But how far they need to go, we're still unsure.
Just finally, can I just check? So you don't meet with the Treasurer to talk about interest rates?
But we talk.
But not about interest rates. That's the main thing you do.
We talk about the economy. I mean, there are other issues the Reserve Bank deals with. Well, there are quite a lot of payment system issues, as you know, where the government's banker. We print the banknotes. We didn't talk about that today. Our decision to change the $5 notes. So, there are a lot of reasons for us to talk. We're both going to India next week to the G20 meeting, so I'll spend a lot of time with the Treasurer next week. So, and that's always been the case with Treasurers.
I just want to check that point with you. So you don't talk to the Treasurer about interest rates, but the Treasury Secretary sits on the board of the bank. So is that how that communication occurs?
I don't know what takes place between the Treasury Secretary and the Treasurer, but the Treasury Secretary is on the board in his own right, and I don't know what he says to the Treasurer after the board meeting, but I do not speak to the Treasurer between the board meeting and the announcement.
Okay.
And that's always been the way, so there's nothing unusual here. This is just the way the system is operated.
Thank you,
Yep.
Mr Lowe. Just a couple of quick questions from Senator O'Neill, who's been very patient.
I have. I've been listening with great interest. Thank you very much, Mr Lowe and Ms Bullock, for being here. And it's been an exercise in, I think, civic education. As you said, people are very interested in what you do now, and it's clear that there are 9 of you making the decision, Mr Lowe, although you are the one most targeted with commentary in the media. Ms Bullock, you're similarly responsible. The reality is there's no minister in the room today, and this is about this separation that many people who are paying mortgages wouldn't have any idea about until they're starting to pay attention because of the concern. So my questions go a little to some of the commentary from Senator McKim. As a representative of the people of New South Wales, I'm very proud to represent such a sensible group of people as Australians, but their concerns are very real at the moment. And I find Australians will trust a good, stable government if they know that jobs that are important are being done properly. Mr McKim asked you about the sources of information that you have, and there's been implications about an imbalance in that. Yeah. My request is, how closely are you listening to people? You mentioned people, livelihoods, jobs and businesses, and the economy as core concerns for you and the board in making your decisions. You also mentioned letters that are arriving. What comfort can Australians take from your assurances here today that you really do listen and understand what's happening to ordinary people whose job it is for us to represent, whether we're in the government or the opposition or on the crossbenches?
Ultimately, all our policies are to help people. That's what the Reserve Bank is about, to help kind of people. We want people to have jobs, we want their savings protected, we want them to face low rates of inflation. So it can sometimes seem very abstract when we talk about the inflation rate and the unemployment rate, but it's all about people, having people with good jobs, rising real wages, keeping their savings safe. That's what we talk about every single one of our board meetings. We have to make complex decisions, and when we're making those decisions, we rely on a whole range of information, data, what we're hearing from business, but also what we're hearing from the community sector. So
you mentioned
it's all about. It is all about people. I'm glad you asked the question, because that's what we do. We're here to help people keep their savings safe, low inflation, and get them jobs.
You've talked a little bit about the understanding about inflation and its impact, and we've got generational divide of people who might understand that and people who might not. You've also mentioned ACOS, the Financial Council, who talk to people all the time and who seek financial advice, some politicians, and expressing the concern of their community. You also mentioned your diary. How actively, at this point of time, given the concern amongst the community and the raising awareness about the importance of managing inflation, how actively are you seeking to understand, in addition to the letter writers, what's going on for ordinary Australians? Have you changed your practice? Do you have any proposals to increase that communication with people out on the ground, so to speak, small businesses and mortgage holders?
The Reserve Bank isn't just me. This is the frustration I have. We've got a fantastic team, and they're out there. We've got a kind of community and business liaison team, and their job is to go and talk to business and community representatives, and they share with me what they're hearing, and then sometimes I'll have the opportunity to directly engage with the community sector as well, and I welcome opportunities to do that. And I've been to the financial counselling service in Surrey Hills, and you and I went there together. We heard harrowing stories, and when I've been in Perth, I've visited quite a few community groups, and I've got an appetite to do it. I've got a busy diary, but where I can do it. But the Reserve Bank is more than just me.
I think that's become very clear in the course of today. Thank you very much, Mr. Lowe. Thank you, Chair.
Feedback from Western Australia Governor has always been very positive, so congratulations.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Lowe and Ms. Bullock, for joining us today. The Senate really appreciates your time and making yourselves available for our scrutiny. That concludes this session. You go with our thanks.
Thank you.
And the committee will now break until 1:45.